The cameras stopped recording sometime in late July 2019. Not the cameras inside Epstein's cell. There were no cameras inside his cell. I mean the cameras in the hallway outside it. The cameras covering the special housing unit of the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Lower Manhattan, where the most high-profile federal prisoner in the country was being held without bail on sex trafficking charges. They stopped recording, for reasons that were, depending on who you ask, either a long-standing technical deficiency or a coincidence so catastrophic it almost defies categorization. Epstein died on August 10th. The cameras had not been recording for roughly 2 weeks before that. That's where this case starts, not with the theory, with the fact. Jeffrey Epstein was arrested on July 6, 2019, at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, stepping off a private jet returning from Paris. Federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York charged him with sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy. The indictment alleged he ran a systematic abuse operation out of his Manhattan mansion and his Palm Beach estate, recruiting girls as young as 14, paying them, and then paying them more to recruit others. This was not new information to anyone who had been paying attention. The Miami Herald had published a year-long investigation by reporter Julie Kay Brown in late 2018 that laid out the abuse in exhaustive detail, including how Epstein had previously evaded federal prosecution through a 2008 plea deal in Florida, a deal that allowed him to serve 13 months in county jail while working at his office during the day, a deal that federal prosecutors later acknowledged failed to notify his victims as required by law. That deal was negotiated by Alexander Acosta, who was then the U.S. attorney in Miami and who, by the time Brown's investigation was published, had become Donald Trump's Secretary of Labor. So Epstein walked into federal custody in July 2019 carrying not just the charges, but the political weight of a case that had been badly mishandled once before. He had a trial date. He had attorneys. He had, according to court filings, a net worth somewhere around $600 million. And he had a very, very long list of names in his phones, his emails, and his flight logs. That context matters for everything that follows. 18 days before his death, on July 23rd, Epstein was found on the floor of his cell in the special housing unit. There was a strip of bedsheet around his neck. Prison officials called it an apparent suicide attempt. His attorneys later suggested it may have been an assault, that his cellmate at the time, Nicholas Tartaglione, a former police officer awaiting trial on 4 murder charges, may have attacked him. Tartaglione denied this. The matter was never resolved conclusively. What happened next matters enormously. Epstein was placed on suicide watch, which is standard. You find someone in that condition, you put them under constant observation. 6 days later, after a psychiatric evaluation, he was taken off suicide watch. The psychology department at MCC determined he no longer required it. The Inspector General's report, released in 2023, found that determination was made after a single examination. Epstein was returned to the special housing unit. The psychology department also determined and documented that he needed to be housed with a cellmate. He was not housed with a cellmate, not immediately, and then, critically, not at all. On August 9th, the day before his death, his cellmate was transferred out of MCC New York. Staff knew Epstein was now alone. Nobody assigned him a new one. The last time Epstein was seen alive by someone who clearly, unambiguously saw him was at 7:49 p.m. On August 9th, guard Tova Noel escorted him back to the special housing unit after he had met with his lawyers. His attorneys later told investigators he had seemed upbeat, not distressed, not despondent, upbeat. Surveillance footage shows Noel briefly walking past his cell at 10:30 p.m. That's the last documented contact with his tier. The 2 guards assigned to check on him through the night, Noel and a second officer named Michael Thomas, were supposed to look in on every inmate every 30 minutes. They didn't. What they did, according to the criminal indictment against them, was browse the internet on their computers and sleep for hours. Footage obtained by prosecutors showed that no one conducted any inmate count or rounds after 10:30 p.m. No one entered the tier where Epstein's cell was located. They then signed paperwork affirming that they had performed the required checks. Epstein was found unresponsive at 6:30 a.m. on August 10th. So the window here, the unobserved window, is roughly 8 hours. The guards were later indicted for falsifying records. They eventually entered deferred prosecution agreements, meaning they avoided conviction if they complied with certain conditions. They were not sentenced. They were never criminally convicted of anything. Here is where things become harder to explain away. The DOJ Inspector General's report confirmed what investigators had already suspected. Nearly all of the cameras in and around the special housing unit where Epstein was housed had stopped recording sometime in late July 2019. And that malfunction continued through the date of his death. The live video feed was still functioning. Guards at monitoring stations could theoretically see a real-time image, but nothing was being recorded to storage. There was no tape, no file, no archive. This wasn't a secret inside MCC. The Inspector General found the deficiency was long-standing. It wasn't new. The system had been broken for a while, and nobody had fixed it. So, when investigators needed to reconstruct what happened on the night of August 9th to 10th, the cameras in the hallway outside Epstein's cell were useless as a historical record. But, and this part is important, not completely useless. Some footage existed from other areas of the facility. And in February 2026, when the DOJ released documents as part of the Epstein Files Transparency Act, investigators reviewing what footage did exist spotted something: an orange-colored figure moving up the stairway toward Epstein's locked housing tier at approximately 10:39 p.m. On August 9th, roughly 9 minutes after the last documented check by the guards. An internal FBI memorandum described the figure as possibly an inmate. A separate DOJ Inspector General review concluded it may have been a corrections officer carrying orange linen or bedding. I'll be honest, that's an inconclusive description. Possibly an inmate and possibly a corrections officer with sheets are not the same thing, and neither the FBI nor the OIG resolved which interpretation is correct. But the fact that there's a documented, unidentified figure approaching Epstein's tier during the exact window when the guards were asleep and not checking on him, that's not nothing. That's a legitimate open question. The New York City Chief Medical Examiner, Dr. Barbara Sampson, conducted a 4-hour autopsy on August 11th and officially ruled the cause of death as suicide by hanging. That should probably be the end of the conversation. Medical examiners make these determinations professionally. That's their job. Except Epstein's estate hired their own forensic pathologist, Dr. Michael Baden, to observe the autopsy. Baden is not a fringe figure. He spent decades in this field, including a stint as New York City's chief medical examiner in the late 1970s. And he has testified in some of the most consequential cases in American legal history. After reviewing the findings, Baden publicly stated that the injuries to Epstein's body were, in his assessment, far more consistent with homicidal strangulation than suicidal hanging. Specifically, the autopsy documented fractures of both superior horns of the thyroid cartilage and a fracture of the hyoid bone, all with accompanying hemorrhage. Baden said he had never, in 50 years of death investigations, seen that pattern of fractures in a confirmed jail suicide. The medical examiner's office pushed back. Other forensic experts noted that hyoid bone fractures do occur in hangings, particularly in older adults. Studies suggest they appear in roughly a quarter of hanging suicides. The counter-argument is that Epstein's fractures weren't just the hyoid. They involved multiple structural elements of the neck. That pattern is less common. What nobody disputes is that the injury profile created genuine forensic ambiguity. Even experts who ultimately accepted the suicide ruling acknowledged the fractures were unusual and warranted scrutiny. This isn't conspiracy fringe. A published forensic review, as recently as February 2026 in the CT Examiner, concluded that in over 2 decades of forensic practice examining deaths involving hanging and strangulation, I have not observed this pattern of fractures in a confirmed suicidal hanging. The medical examiner's ruling stands, but it stands alongside a documented expert disagreement, not above it. Baden raised other questions that also haven't been cleanly answered. Epstein was close to 6 feet tall and weighed around 185 pounds. Baden questioned whether someone of that size could have generated enough force to cause the observed fractures by hanging from a lower bunk, which is what investigators concluded he had done, using a bed sheet. Baden also noted that Epstein had a CPAP machine in his cell for sleep apnea. The machine had tubing and wiring, materials that would have been longer, stronger, and more practical for a ligature than a bed sheet. Baden couldn't explain why someone planning to hang himself would choose the sheet instead. And then there's the matter of how the scene was handled. Bureau of Prisons policy requires a suicide scene to be treated with the same level of protection as any crime scene in which a death has occurred. Photographs should be taken of the body as found. The scene should be preserved. Neither happened. Epstein's body was moved before it was photographed in position. The scene was not treated like a crime scene. Staff were not following protocol, even in the aftermath. This, I want to be clear, doesn't prove anything. It's consistent with the broader pattern of negligence at MCC that the Inspector General documented in detail, but it also means that any physical evidence that might have resolved the ambiguity was compromised before it could be properly collected. Something I think about whenever I read through the post-August 10th timeline is how quickly the official posture calcified. Within weeks of Epstein's death, the Department of Justice position was suicide. Case closed. The guards failed, the guards were charged, reforms would be made. The medical examiner ruled suicide. Move on. Meanwhile, the people who had the most reason to want Epstein dead, or, at minimum, the most reason to want him unable to testify, were never seriously discussed as part of any investigative framework. The flight logs, the emails, the contact lists. All of that pointed toward powerful people with powerful legal resources and powerful reasons to fear what Epstein might say, or what prosecutors might offer him to say it. That's not accusation. That's context. The Epstein Files Transparency Act, signed into law by President Trump in November 2025, resulted in a release of nearly 3.5 million pages of documents from 5 primary sources, including all DOJ investigations into Epstein's death. The DOJ's official position, reiterated as recently as July 2025, is that Epstein killed himself, that there is no evidence of homicide, and that the case is closed. The Deputy Attorney General announced in January 2026 that the document release was essentially complete. Survivors pushed back publicly. Members of Congress who wrote the legislation also pushed back, citing ongoing redactions and privilege withholdings. Approximately 200,000 pages were redacted based on deliberative process privilege, work product doctrine, and attorney-client privilege. So, 3.5 million pages released, 200,000 withheld or redacted, the official conclusion unchanged. Guard Tova Noel was asked to testify before the House Oversight Committee in March 2026. The circumstances of her testimony have not been fully reported publicly. Let me try to be honest about what we know and what we don't. What the record confirms. The cameras covering Epstein's housing unit had been non-functional for roughly 2 weeks before he died. This is documented by the DOJ Inspector General, not disputed by anyone. The guards assigned to watch him falsified records indicating they had performed checks they did not perform. This is established by criminal indictment and video evidence. Epstein was alone in his cell in violation of the psychology department's documented requirement that he have a cellmate. His cellmate was transferred out the day before he died. No replacement was assigned. The forensic pathologist hired by his estate publicly stated that the autopsy findings were more consistent with homicide than suicide, and that he had never seen the observed injury pattern in a jail suicide across 50 years of practice. The removal of Epstein's body violated Bureau of Prisons protocol for preserving a death scene. An unidentified orange figure was captured approaching his housing tier during the unmonitored window and has not been conclusively identified. What has not been established? No evidence has been publicly produced showing that another person entered Epstein's cell. No physical evidence of a struggle has been confirmed beyond the disputed autopsy findings. The official ruling, suicide by hanging, remains the legal determination. The DOJ concluded in July 2025 that Epstein killed himself and that no credible evidence of homicide was found. Whether you find that conclusion satisfying depends largely on whether you think the documented failures at MCC were the product of negligence or something else. The argument against the murder theory is essentially this. Yes, everything went wrong. The cameras, the guards, the cellmate, the scene preservation. But incompetence is common. Federal prisons are chronically understaffed. The MCC was specifically known to be badly managed. Coincidences happen in broken systems. The argument for deeper suspicion is essentially this. Yes, incompetence is common. But this was not random incompetence. Almost every specific failure targeted, precisely, sequentially, the systems that would have detected, recorded, or prevented something happening to Epstein. The cameras were already broken when he needed them most. The cellmate left the day before. The guards were asleep during the exact hours in question. The scene was not preserved after. Each one of those individually has an innocent explanation. Together, I genuinely don't know. I don't think anyone does. What I do know is that Jeffrey Epstein was the one man who could have put some of the most powerful people in the world on trial. He had documented contact with heads of state, royalty, senior executives, politicians on both sides of the Atlantic, and figures connected to multiple foreign governments. He had leverage. He had information. And he died alone, unobserved, in a locked cell, with cameras that weren't recording, while the guards who were supposed to watch him slept and signed papers saying they hadn't. The official record says he killed himself. I'm not here to tell you that's wrong, but I think the honest thing, the intellectually honest thing, is to acknowledge that the circumstances surrounding his death have never been fully explained. The Inspector General found serious documented failures. The forensic evidence was ambiguous. The critical video was gone. The scene was mishandled. Those are not fringe observations. They're in the official reports. The Epstein Files Transparency Act was supposed to provide answers. What it produced mostly was volume. Nearly 3.5 million pages, more documents than anyone will ever read. A former attorney general who initially refused to testify before Congress about how those documents were handled, then agreed in April 2026 to appear before the House Oversight Committee, with testimony scheduled for later this month. Whether that testimony produces anything of substance, I have no idea. What I do know is that the questions haven't gone away. They've accumulated. If you've been following this case, really following it, not just the headlines, subscribe. We're going to stay with this as long as the evidence keeps moving, and right now, it is still moving. One question worth sitting with. The camera system at MCC had been broken for weeks before Epstein's death. The Inspector General confirmed this was a long-standing deficiency. Multiple staff members knew about it. Nobody fixed it. Do you think that matters? Do you think the timing is explainable? Leave your read on it below.